March 20th, 2013. A hotel room in Cairo, Egypt. A 47-year-old man weighing over 300 pounds was found dead by hotel staff who hadn't seen him for days. The news reached the bodybuilding community quickly, and within hours, forums filled with reactions from fans and fellow competitors. Nasser El Sonbaty was a retired athlete who many believed had been wrongfully denied the most prestigious title in the sport. He spoke 7 languages fluently, held a master's degree, and was known for engaging in serious discussions on politics and training alike. Over the years, however, a deep bitterness settled over him. By the end, he had largely withdrawn from public life, and he died alone in a city far from the stages where he had once presented one of the most remarkable physiques in competitive bodybuilding. His decline was gradual and visible to those who followed his career. It traced back to a single controversial night in 1997, when a judging decision set the course for the rest of his life. Nasser El Sonbaty did not fit the profile of a typical bodybuilder. Born in Stuttgart, Germany in 1965 to an Egyptian father and a Yugoslavian mother, he was raised in a household where education and intellectual development were central. He began learning languages at a young age, and by adulthood he spoke 7 fluently: German, English, Arabic, French, Italian, Serbian, and Croatian. He earned a master's degree in political science, history, and sociology from the University of Augsburg. His professors had anticipated a career in academia or diplomacy. Bodybuilding was not part of that plan. In 1983, at 18 years old, Sonbaty was playing competitive soccer and entered a gym to strengthen his legs for the sport. His body responded to weight training with unusual speed and density. Within months, he was training seriously, and within a few years, he was competing. By the early 1990s, he had turned professional, stepping onto stages across Europe with a physique that drew immediate attention. He never set aside his intellectual pursuits. Known in bodybuilding circles as the Professor, he often wore his signature glasses during interviews and spoke about the sport with a level of analytical depth that set him apart. He could discuss training methodology, address the pharmacological dimensions of performance enhancement, and shift with equal ease into conversations about Middle Eastern politics or European history. At close to 280 pounds on stage, he presented a figure that was difficult to categorize, a serious competitor who also engaged substantively with the ideas and systems surrounding the sport. Through the early 1990s, as he placed higher and higher at international competitions, his standing in the sport became clear. Nasser El Sonbaty was a one-of-a-kind presence in professional bodybuilding, and his career would not repeat itself. By 1994, Nasser had developed into one of the most physically imposing competitors in professional bodybuilding. His first appearance on the Mr. Olympia stage that year drew immediate attention. At close to 280 pounds, he presented a physique of dense, detailed muscle that stood out among the field. His back, in particular, carried a level of muscular definition and thickness that was difficult to capture fully in photographs. Joe Weider, widely regarded as the most influential figure in the history of bodybuilding, recognized Sonbaty's potential early. The combination of his physical presence and his ability to speak articulately and at length on a range of subjects made him a valuable asset to the sport, someone who could represent bodybuilding in television appearances, magazine features, and corporate settings with credibility. His placements at the Olympia reflected a steady upward trajectory. He finished 4th in 1994, 3rd in 1995, and 2nd in 1996. Each year, his physique continued to develop, adding mass while maintaining the conditioning that distinguished top-tier competitors. His shoulders, arms, and quadriceps grew considerably over this period. In the off-season, he pushed past 300 pounds, then dieted down to between 270 and 280 for competition. The training and preparation demands were significant, and Sonbaty approached them with consistent commitment. 1996 also brought a setback. Following his 3rd place finish at that year's Olympia, Sonbaty tested positive for diuretics during post-competition drug screening. The result was an immediate disqualification. His 3rd place finish was stripped, along with the associated prize money. Diuretics are prohibited in competitive bodybuilding because they can be used to mask other banned substances and to reduce water retention ahead of competition. Sonbaty stated that the positive test was a mistake, and that he was unaware the specific compound he used carried a ban. Reactions within the sport were divided. The incident affected his standing, and questions about his compliance with competition rules circulated in the months that followed. Sonbaty returned to competition with renewed focus heading into 1997. The landscape of the sport that year was shaped in part by the condition of Dorian Yates, the reigning Mr. Olympia. Yates had sustained significant wear on his body from years of intensive training, and injuries had become a recurring factor in his preparation. Sonbaty, now firmly established among the top competitors, entered the 1997 season as one of the strongest contenders for the title. September 1997. Dorian Yates had dominated the Mr. Olympia for 6 consecutive years, defeating every competitor who had stood against him. But weeks before that year's competition, Yates suffered a serious injury. During a heavy training session, he tore his left triceps. The damage was significant. His arm lost its shape and symmetry, and it was far from competition ready. Most competitors would have withdrawn, taken the year to recover, and returned the following season. Yates chose to compete anyway. Nasser El Sonbaty stepped on stage that night in exceptional condition. His back was wider and thicker than it had ever been, with deep muscle definition across the entire structure. His legs carried remarkable size, with clear separation and detail. His conditioning was precise, his posing was controlled, and he carried himself with confidence throughout his routine. During his back double bicep pose, the audience responded with visible enthusiasm. In the side-by-side comparisons with Yates, the contrast was clear. Yates's injured arm was visibly diminished next to Nasser's balanced physique. By most accounts in the room that night, Nasser had delivered the stronger presentation. Then the scores were announced. First place, Dorian Yates. Second place, Nasser El Sonbaty. The reaction was immediate and sharp. Boos came from throughout the venue. Fans and observers alike expressed disbelief at the result. In the days and weeks that followed, several figures within the sport spoke publicly about the decision. Flex Wheeler, widely regarded as one of the most aesthetically gifted bodybuilders of his generation, stated that Nasser should have won. Sean Ray called the decision a disgrace. The photographs from that competition have been compared repeatedly in the years since. Placed side by side, they showed a clear difference in condition and presentation between the two competitors. Yates was, at that point, the established champion, the face of the sport, the figure who drew media attention and brought visibility to competitive bodybuilding. The judge's decision reflected, for many observers, the weight that reputation carried in the judging process. Nasser received second place, and with it the financial and professional consequences that came with not winning. The financial gap between first and second at the Olympia was substantial. The Mr. Olympia title carried endorsement deals, supplement contracts, guest posing appearances and seminar opportunities worth millions. It also meant becoming the primary public face of bodybuilding for the duration of that title. Nasser lost access to all of it. He watched as Yates retired the following year, finishing his career as a 7-time Mr. Olympia. Nasser, meanwhile, continued competing, still pursuing the title that many believed he had already earned. The frustration from that 1997 result followed him through the interviews and public appearances that came after. His expressions and demeanor in those recordings reflected a competitor who felt the outcome had been unfair. After 1997, Nasser's competitive trajectory shifted. He continued to step on stage and compete for the Olympia title, but his results moved in a different direction. At the 1998 Olympia, he placed 7th. His physique had not declined dramatically, but his performances lacked the consistency and intensity of previous years. The mental weight of the 1997 result appeared to affect his approach to competition in measurable ways. 1999 brought a partial recovery. That year, Nasser won the Arnold Classic, the second most prestigious competition in professional bodybuilding. He defeated a strong field and demonstrated that his ability to compete at the highest level remained intact. The victory was acknowledged by the industry, and for that period, it represented a meaningful result. But it was not the Olympia, and that distinction mattered to Nasser and to the observers who had followed his career since 1997. The years that followed saw a gradual decline in both his placements and his physical condition. Through the early 2000s, his finishes moved further down the rankings. 5th in some competitions, 8th in others, occasionally outside the top 10 entirely. His body had carried significant mass for decades, and the cumulative physical toll of that became increasingly apparent. Injuries accumulated. By 2005, at the age of 40, Nasser stepped away from competitive bodybuilding. There was no formal retirement event or public statement. He simply stopped competing. Once competition ended, Nasser's body weight increased significantly. During his competing years, he had carried substantial off-season weight, sometimes reaching 310 or 320 pounds between shows. Without the structure of competition preparation and the dietary discipline it required, his weight continued to climb. Reports indicated he reached somewhere in the range of 330 to 340 pounds at his heaviest. The physical demands of carrying that much mass affected his mobility and daily movement in noticeable ways. He did not speak publicly about his health during this period. His connections within the bodybuilding industry became less frequent over the years. Nasser had lived in several countries, Germany, Egypt, and the United States at different points in his career, without establishing a long-term base in any of them. By the mid-2000s, he had largely withdrawn from the public side of the sport that had once defined his life. In 2008, Nasser began giving interviews that drew significant attention across the bodybuilding community. These were not the typical reflections of a retired athlete looking back on a career with gratitude. Nasser directed sharp criticism at nearly everyone involved in the sport, with little regard for the fallout. He named judges directly, accusing them of corruption and favoritism. He challenged fellow competitors, dismissing their achievements and questioning their integrity. He criticized supplement companies for misleading consumers. He spoke openly about the political maneuvering behind major competitions. In doing so, he severed nearly every professional relationship he had built over the course of his career. What drew attention was not only what he said, but the manner in which he said it. The measured, articulate figure known as the Professor was no longer present in these interviews. Nasser spoke with undisguised contempt, returning repeatedly to the 1997 judging decision. He called it fraudulent. He stated that the sport was compromised from the top down, that politics carried more weight than physique, and that talent alone was not enough without the right political alignment. Some of his statements resonated with people who had spent years in the industry. However, the intensity behind his words made many uncomfortable. This was not a measured critique. It was the accumulated frustration of years, expressed all at once. Around that time, a figure known as GH15 emerged on bodybuilding forums, particularly on boards where enhanced athletes discussed their protocols openly. This anonymous poster shared detailed knowledge of performance enhancement, training methodology, and insider information that suggested first-hand experience at the highest level of the sport. The writing carried a distinctive tone, direct and blunt. A number of people came to believe that GH15 was Nasser posting under a different identity. The linguistic patterns were consistent. The level of detail pointed to someone with significant professional experience. The frustration directed at certain figures in the sport aligned with Nasser's known positions. Nasser did not confirm or deny the speculation, and the question remained open. What set Nasser apart from most retired bodybuilders was his willingness to speak plainly about what competing at that level actually required. While others avoided the subject or attributed their physiques to conventional training and nutrition, Nasser discussed the use of performance-enhancing substances directly. He talked about growth hormone, insulin, and other compounds, and the scale at which they were used. He did not present this as something to be followed. He simply stated it as fact, something he felt others in the sport were unwilling to do. This directness was received favorably by some and poorly by others. Supplement companies objected because it undermined their marketing. Federations were uncomfortable because it exposed the limitations of their testing programs. The sport moved to distance itself from him in the years that followed. Former associates stopped responding to him. Promoters removed him from events. Publications stopped including him in retrospectives. Nasser El Sonbaty became largely unwelcome in the industry he had devoted his career to. His response to this was notably indifferent. The isolation appeared to confirm, in his view, what he had already been saying. He had been passed over in 1997, and now the sport was working to remove him from its records. The bitterness that had shaped his later public statements had, by this point, become the defining fact of his relationship with bodybuilding, and it had turned a once respected competitor into a cautionary example of what can happen when talent and politics collide without resolution. In March 2013, Nasser traveled to Cairo, Egypt, the homeland of his father and the place where his roots ran deep, despite having spent most of his life in Europe. The reasons for the trip have never been fully confirmed. Some reports indicate he was visiting family. Others suggest he was exploring business opportunities. There were also those who believed he was looking to step back from the pressures of the bodybuilding world that had taken a significant toll on him. Whatever brought him to that Egyptian hotel room, he did not leave it alive. His health had been declining for years. Carrying over 300 pounds on a frame that was deteriorating and bearing the cumulative damage of decades of extreme physical stress, his condition was poor. People who had seen him in the months before the trip noted that he did not look well. His breathing was labored. His mobility was limited. The signs were there, but Nasser had spent his entire career pushing his body beyond what most would consider safe. That pattern did not change in retirement. On March 20th, hotel staff entered his room after he failed to respond to repeated calls and knocks. Nasser El Sonbaty was dead at 47 years old. The news moved quickly through the bodybuilding community. Tributes came from competitors, fans, and even individuals he had publicly criticized in his later years. His passing prompted a broader reflection on the man he had been, both on stage and off it. The circumstances surrounding his death drew immediate scrutiny. Initial reports indicated he had contracted malaria, which triggered a kidney infection his body was not equipped to fight. The kidney failure then led to heart failure, and his system shut down. Other accounts suggested the kidney problems had been developing over a much longer period, a consequence of years of heavy diuretic use and other substances that damaged his renal function. There were additional factors that few were willing to discuss openly. Sustaining a physique of that magnitude over that many years placed extraordinary strain on the body, and that strain accumulated. No autopsy results were made public. The official cause of death is listed as complications from kidney and heart failure, potentially triggered by malaria. The bodybuilding community broadly understood the situation to be more complex than that single explanation. This was not an isolated incident of bad luck. It was the outcome of a lifestyle that tested the limits of human physiology over decades. Nasser had long been open about the methods he used to build and maintain his body. His death became for many a visible consequence of those methods. His remains were returned to Germany for burial. The funeral was a small gathering, attended by family and a few close friends from his earlier years in the sport. Much of the broader bodybuilding industry did not attend. The man who under different circumstances might have spent his later years as a celebrated champion and mentor, was instead buried well before his time. The questions his life raised about recognition, about the toll of the sport, about what might have been different, remain unanswered. Nasser El Sonbaty's story should have been one of triumph. A first-generation immigrant who spoke 7 languages, earned a master's degree, and built one of the most impressive physiques in bodybuilding history. He represented something the sport needed: intelligence, articulation, and a bridge between the muscle-bound stereotype and the real world. He showed that a person could be massive and educated, powerful and thoughtful, dominant on stage and composed off it. For Arab and Muslim communities worldwide, he was a pioneer, demonstrating that bodybuilding excellence was not reserved for any particular background or ethnicity. Young athletes across the Middle East and North Africa looked at Nasser and saw possibility. They saw themselves reflected in someone who had reached the top of the sport. His legacy, however, became inseparable from the bitterness that defined his final years. When people discuss Nasser today, the conversation tends to return to 1997, to the robbery, to the interviews, to the anger. His achievements get footnoted beneath the controversy. The 1999 Arnold Classic victory reads as a minor detail compared to the Olympia that got away. His intelligence and education become background information rather than defining characteristics. The bitterness did not just affect him while he was alive. It shaped his entire legacy after death, reducing one of bodybuilding's most talented competitors into a cautionary example about resentment. The difficult irony is that Nasser was likely correct about much of what he said. The sport was political. Judges did play favorites. Marketing and money influenced decisions more than physiques did. His transparency about performance enhancement was honest in a sport built on silence about those realities. But being right did not make him happy. Being right did not earn him the Olympia title. Being right did not prevent him from dying alone in a Cairo hotel room at 47. The truth in his case carried a cost he ultimately paid in full. There is a persistent question about what could have been. If he had won in 1997, endorsement deals would likely have followed. His face would have appeared on magazine covers internationally. He could have retired as Mr. Olympia, moved into coaching and mentoring, and used his education and language skills to expand the sport's reach in new markets. Rather than bitter forum posts and confrontational interviews, he could have been developing gyms across the Middle East, building a legacy that extended beyond his own competitive career. The professor could have spent those years teaching, passing along decades of experience to athletes who needed that guidance. That potential disappeared because of one disputed decision on one September night. His effect on Arab and Muslim bodybuilding remained significant. He opened doors that had been closed. He demonstrated that excellence operated without regard to ethnic or cultural boundaries. Bodybuilders from Egypt, Lebanon, Kuwait, and elsewhere point to him as a reason they pursued the sport, as evidence that they belonged on the international stage. That portion of his legacy remains separate from the bitterness. It is the part most likely to endure. Nasser El Sonbaty died as the uncrowned king, a champion who never held the title he spent his career pursuing. His story carries weight not only because he died young, but because he spent his final years consumed by anger over something he could not change, watching his health decline while the sport continued without him. Brilliance and talent in the end were not enough. He was right about being wronged, but that rightness brought him no peace. The tragedy of Nasser El Sonbaty is not only what happened to him, it is what he allowed to happen to himself, the gradual erosion that comes from holding on to bitterness until it becomes the only thing left. The sport failed him in 1997, but the deeper loss was the one he imposed on himself in the years that followed.